I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Welcome to the Vietnam Veterans News Podcast. News of interest about Vietnam veterans from a Vietnam veteran. Now, here's your host, Mack Payne.
This is Mack Payne here with episode 17503 of the Vietnam Veteran News Podcast. News about the Vietnam War and the brave veterans who served there, as told to you by yours truly, a Vietnam veteran. On this podcast episode today, we have a very special guest. His name is John Shoemaker from the Boston, Massachusetts area. He was featured on this podcast back in episode 1751, where he talked about what Memorial Day means to him. Specifically, it reminds him of the smell of death. I talked to him about that episode, and he was kind enough to come on to the podcast and tell us more about his time in Vietnam and what he's done after Vietnam, because he has written a considerable amount about his time in the Vietnam War, and it's very, very interesting. He was in the 196th Infantry Brigade, which was part of the Americal Division up in the I Corps area of Vietnam, and it was some bad country. Of course, over in Vietnam, all the country was bad, but they had some tough times up there, and he was right in the middle of it, and that's why it's going to be so interesting to talk to him. He's going to start out by telling us his background about how he got into the military and some very interesting things about when he was in OCS and what happened just before they went to OCS. And then a little bit more about what he's done afterwards and a little bit of his biography. And then he's going to share with us one of his favorite columns titled Vietnam Diary, when he was way out in the Badlands of Vietnam at a place called Camp Duck, not too far from the Laotian border. I'm sure you're going to enjoy it. And John, thank you so much for coming on to the podcast. How are things over? Wait a minute, right now you're in your luxurious condo over on the Fort Lauderdale area, aren't you?
Exactly.
I know it's nice to spend a little time in both places. It's wonderful to be able to go back up north, like in Massachusetts, and come down here for a while. All I care about right now is hearing you tell us about your time in the military and what you've done since, some of these writings that you've been doing. So, John, you've got the microphone. Take it away.
Thank you, Mac. I truly appreciate the chance to do something that is new for me. This is my very first podcast. Well, my time really starts at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. During my last year, most college kids were watching Walter Cronkite. Every week you'd see the death count, the casualty count, all of the film from Vietnam, and it was a scary time. It was amazing to me because we had a lot of the kids that were so upset about it. They were doing the protests and they were storming the administration buildings and all this sort of thing. But I really had a very contrarian view at the time. I really felt I could make a contribution as a leader and hopefully save lives, American soldiers. Now, that was so ridiculous to some that I didn't really talk about it. We actually had some that committed suicide by jumping off the dormitories and landing in front of my dormitory room, all because they were all hyped up and anxious. Maybe they're on drugs. They're just whacked out. In any event, after I graduated, I needed to graduate so I could get accepted to OCS with a degree. Found myself going through Fort Dix, Basic, Fort Polk, Tigerland, before getting to Fort Benning, where OCS, the class was going to start. However, we got there a little early, too early, and so we had to wait for 3 weeks before the OCS class could start. So they made the proposition, the Army said, look, you can work on KP for the next 3 weeks, or you can go to airborne school. Well, the idea of jumping out of a plane wasn't exactly appealing to me at the time. There's no way in the world I wanted to do KP again after having done it at Fort Polk during the summer when I suffered from heat exhaustion. It was just terrible. So as it turns out, the entire class signed up. We were one of the, if not the first from World War II, where the entire OCS class went airborne. And we got our wings. We started OCS in 1969. We had some outstanding graduates. After that, I became a training officer at Fort Benning for a few months. I should note that before I went to OCS and right after airborne school, that was Christmas time. So I ended up coming home, marrying my sweetheart from college. And when we got back down to Benning, I really couldn't see her for 18 weeks. It was ridiculous, except for 1 hour on Sundays. But anyways, after that, my time as a training officer, I went to jungle school in Panama at the Canal Zone, Fort Sherman. I will say that that training at Fort Sherman was just incredible. It was the best training, and it saved my life in several situations that were exact scenarios as they presented during the training at the Canal Zone. I really appreciated that. It was designed for infantry officers coming out of OCS and preliminary to going to Vietnam. Now, it is true, I signed up for infantry in the very beginning. I didn't want to go into any of the other armed forces and certainly into other parts of the Army. I wanted to focus on infantry. When I graduated from OCS, they did give me a choice of going to Korea or Germany. And I said, no, I did all this training for 2 years. I'm going to Vietnam. And then after jungle school, the same kind of thing. So I actually volunteered 3 times for Vietnam. That's because I was a gung-ho, whacked-out kid, maybe. But I finally did get to Vietnam by luck, by chance, by the lottery. I ended up in Chu Lai with the Americal Division. After more training, now this is after 2 years of training, what do? The first thing I get there is they put me through 2 more weeks of training in country to understand the local strategies, tactics of the Viet Cong and the MVA and their weapons and all this sort of thing. But I was so fed up with all the training, I said, it can't get much worse than this. So then I was sent up to Hawk Hill, about an hour north of Chu Lai off of Highway 1, which was their headquarters for the 2nd Battalion, 1st Infantry of the 196th Infantry Brigade. And on that fire base, they had several howitzer units. They provided artillery support for a number of units, 196th and even the Marines, and helicopter support. They had a big landing pad there. And sure enough, my time being introduced as a lieutenant platoon leader, I was given the responsibility for the 3rd platoon of Bravo Company. Now, a lot of things happened between then and about, I arrived in March, April, May, June, and then finally July, they sent me to a place called Cam Duck. So I want to focus on Cam Duck, share with you what happened. This was one of actually a half a dozen major events that are true stories. And I can give you names and places and that sort of thing. And for whatever reason, and maybe it's true for all veterans, certain things are frozen in my mind. And I remember it vividly. I can smell, I can see, I can hear so many things about my experience in Vietnam that has stayed with me forever.
And John, let me break in here. Can you tell us approximately where Cam Duck was located in reference to Chu Lai?
You can draw almost a straight line going west all the way to the Laotian border. And just a bit south, a few clicks, and there you have this old Green Beret airstrip that was good enough to accommodate C-130s and was there for a number of years. The real story behind Cam Duck, and Cam is K-H-A-M, and Duck is D-U-C. So Cam Duck was this, as I said, a former Green Beret Special Forces airstrip. The location of it is almost like a small-scale Dien Bien Phu. It was an airstrip with fortifications in the middle of the airstrip to the side and surrounded by mountains. On the east side ran a river, and this river had carved somewhat of a gorge that went down dramatically from the side, a few hundred meters off of the edge of the airstrip. down to the river, and then you'd have to go up a couple hundred to get to the top of the other side on a plateau. Surrounded by mountains, the key aspect was that it was really just a few clicks from the entrance into South Vietnam from Laos of the famous Ho Chi Minh Trail. And so if you were to stop the influx of men and material from North Vietnam, this was one of the key places that you would want to catch them. Well, in 1968, in what is called Mini-Tet, which was in May of 68, you had about 1,500 special forces, which included CIDG forces, local, civilian, indigenous defense forces, and another 300 civilians. And they were working this airstrip and with several bases on the mountaintops surrounding this airstrip of Cam Duck. Well, in 68, all hell broke loose, and the NVA sent in an entire division. More than 10,000 soldiers were closing in on Cam Duck. Once our forces understood what was happening, it went right up the chain of command to General Westmoreland. He had to have a discussion with President Johnson as to what to do because of this following all the activity of Tet that happened just a few months earlier and the commitment that could be made or not. Well, it was decided that given the size of the forces, even with sending in B-52s and Puff the Magic Dragons and all of this other air defense activity, there was no way of stopping this division. So the decision was made to pull out completely. And that meant you had to send in these planes to pick up the 1,500 to actually 1,800 personnel and to do it under fire. And in the course of doing that, over the course of 3 or 4 days, a C-130 was shot down and was left at the strip. You had a C-123. You had several Chinooks, Hueys, a Loach. I mean, all kinds of equipment was lost. And in fact, in the recovery of all the personnel, a Medal of Honor winner was Lieutenant Colonel Joe Jackson, who had flown in to recover personnel time after time. So it was quite a battle. You can look it up in Google, Cam Duck, Vietnam, 1968, and it will show you pictures of the planes that were on fire and the story that is behind Joe Jackson's Medal of Honor. In the end, there were about 27 Americans killed. Their bodies were not recovered in 1968 because they evacuated and they were carrying over 100 wounded. One of their soldiers was actually captured. It was really a harrowing time. They couldn't lift out everybody, so there was several hundred that actually broke out through the ring of NVA forces and made an overland escape. It was an incredible, harrowing story, and that's something that is also in the annals of military history that goes down as a big win. In any event, how do I get involved in all this? Well, here it is, 1970. No American forces had been back to Cam Duck since May of 68, when all hell broke loose. And all the forces that had to leave under duress and the men that were lost. And so it was decided in August of 70, part of Elk Canyon was the name of the campaign, to go back and recover the American remains. Now, I have to admit, at the time, as a platoon leader, we weren't given a whole lot of information about the background. I had no idea how bad it was in 68. But we were told the whole battalion's going in, along with other forces, ARVNs. We would have CBs to refinish the airstrip, and we would have battalions from other units in. It was going to be a massive airlift. So came the day, I do have a picture of myself standing there on the airstrip at Tam Key, which is just north of Tuai. They had literally dozens of Hueys coming in and to pick up our company, along with others of the battalion, lifted us up, and we were on our way for our first major combat assault into enemy-held territory that had not been in our hands for 2 years. So this is where my story that I would later write about and publish, and I've tried to write a number of stories about my experiences in Vietnam for the sake of memory, for the sake of history, and to honor those that served and those that served and lost during that incredible Vietnam War. I've tried to explain the background to when I would be confronted with the combat assault and the cam duck. And now I will share the details of that in my next episode. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, John, for that excellent description of a Vietnam veteran's thoughts about their service in the war and how they got into it. That was also a very interesting description of the background to Operation Elk Canyon when your unit went back out to Cam Duck, way out in the Badlands. I can hardly wait to hear your story about the incredible thing that happened to your platoon on the hills overlooking the airstrip out at Cam Duck. All you listeners out there, make sure you listen to the next episode, number 1753, where John Shoemaker is going to talk about the incredible event that happened on the mountaintop out near Cam Duck in Vietnam. Thank you for listening to this episode, and you are cordially invited to return to listen to all the episodes on this podcast, the Vietnam Veteran News.
How about that? Ain't that a mess?